I think what's important for us, as I indicated last time, and I tried to reread the potency article on, where she deals in more detail in some ways with quantum theory but develops the notion of potency better, I think, than I did, certainly. But I think in terms of we're lured into thinking, for example, of the Aeonic World-Periphery as something like, an objective version of the horizon of perception. And it's out there, but it's simultaneously with now, because the picture, although it has, it tells us that it's the Aeonic World-Periphery, and that it's in a kind of Aristotelian cyclic motion around the center. The danger of any visualization of it is that we are talking about a realm of potency, and we have to think in what sense, where is, and that's, I think it's a good picture, where is the infant who turns out to be Bach, Beethoven, or Einstein? Where is the Einsteinianness of that fertilized egg? Where is it? And I think that sounds like a dumb question. It is a dumb question, but that's in a sense is what she's calling our attention to, that we have a different dimension with potency, and yet we can't neglect it. It's not nothing, but it isn't finished being, as she would say. And yet, if we're going to account for it all together, I think that's the merit, obviously, of the diagram. We're forced to make it contemporary with an actual finished thing in the picture, because you can't picture the not yet and the maybe and the possible, especially when you're talking about epigenesis, because what we're talking about there is not continuous with the finished world. So the child, say, composing then the Fifth Symphony of quote unquote Beethoven, that actualization of that genius is at the stage of the fertilized egg, is not evident. And that's the problem she keeps working with, a propensity to think of that as somehow decipherable in the egg or in the sperm or something like that. And that's, of course, the propensity or the positivistic hang-up of modern science, which it's constantly fighting even to this day, to be looking and using categories like the DNA and the gene and everything, that they are somehow, in Nietzsche, if we just look closely enough, we'll get it right. We'll see what's underneath there, then that little thing that accounts for, and then you have Beethoven or God consciousness or something like that.
And of course, we have different evolving attachments to different models as we go, with particles, with cells.
Sure.
But what she's offering is one. So it's not that we should read too much into it, I guess, but we should read the right amount. It's not that it's nothing, So right. So I do want to go a little bit deeper, and we'll be, I think, as we go into the sections after this section, we'll be talking about this more. But you mentioned that this might correspond to soul in a certain sense, right? This is maybe a discussion in Desite.
Yeah. I think that, that the whole realm of the Aeonic World-Peripheries is analogously soul.
But is spirit more so out here at the periphery, out here at this farther?
She pushes spirits in there too somehow, and that's in some sense a problem for me. But in any case, it's in there, and it's tied up with this very rich, robust notion of nature as naturans. Nature is naturing, nature is self-creative, and there's nothing left out.
Can I ask a question about that diagram? because so we have the world contacting two circles at two different places, and at least it looks that way. So and one is the Ionic Periphery, and the other is, I guess, called real time. Is that right? What's AN? AN is actual time. That's where. So I guess my question is, why is the world what does it mean that the world's contacting these two separate spheres or circles?
I don't know.
Well, just to be clear, the AJ actuala, what is it? Actuala, the yet.
Yes.
That's the now. So the AJ up at the top there, and then the AN, I think that refers to with the little arrow, the motion of this outer periphery, Aeonicia. So those are the two kinds of time we're talking about. The Aeonicia is this like general periphery, and then the AJ is the tangential point of contact between this sphere which spans the inner circle and the outer circle. So it like is like a ball moving through the cylinder here on this model. And what's interesting is there's similar models in Einstein, in Bergson, and in Alois Wenzel in his book Unsterblichkeit, Immortality. He talks about the development of the concept of the fourth spatial dimension in a similar kind of theoretical physics context, and he has a series of diagrams that progress into something that looks a lot like this.
Well, so the real time, real Zeit, that is the time that goes on independent whether there's any observers in the universe at all, and that contacts the world. And then there's the yet, the now. So there are two places, like I said, that the world contacts. It contacts the real time and this ionic time, ionic peripheral space. But what happens, and so somehow or other the now time is one contact, but there's nothing listed at the lower contact. And I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean.
Well, I think this is a good question, Bill. I'm not sure, but I want to go back to real time. I think is the experienced time for the minds or forms of sentiency.
Oh, really?
I might be wrong. And the Ionic time is also a now, but it's the way the universe as the realm of this what's the term? Ether, and all of these telekies are actuating the cosmos at the time. Now that now is not an experience now separately from the real time.
Okay, all right. So I had it backwards. They're both
together. But
okay.
they it would be odd if they were separated. And here she separates them as on the diagram. But it's still this. The world is we have. I think I call it somewhere here the cosmology of history. That behind, and this sounds very. When I was writing it, New Agey, but there's something about, we all know that, well, we don't know, but we can very, very well imagine that the Cro-Magnon man, the person, the human being who lived, say, 100,000 years ago or something like that, lived in a different age, and that shaped and not only was the person's biology different and physiology different, but there was also her difference was in part tied up with the cosmological physical surroundings. But of course, then there was what Hegel would call the objective spirit. There wasn't probably language. There was no literature, no language, and there was, there weren't all the outpourings, the fruitions of thought over, the 100,000 years or something like that. And so the human being was different, but the ages are, and this is is a kind of a eschatology here. When I was trying to pull all this stuff together, the major voice in all of this on the cultural scene in the 60s and 70s was a Jesuit by the name of Teilhard de Chardin. I don't know how many of you have heard of him, but he was offering a kind of theological cosmology of history, where Christ was he's trying to account for all of history as well as all of cosmology in terms of the incarnation. And she's offering analogously a kind of a cosmology of history, and bringing history and cosmology together insofar as that's possible, because after all, spirit is coming into being, and she doesn't want to say that there's a different human being in the 22nd century human being, 21st century human being, and the Cro-Magnon man. They're still essentially the same, but they're not identically the same in significant ways. And that is to tell that story, you need a kind of account of what the Darwinian would call evolution. But for her, that isn't the right word, because that doesn't account for the sameness and difference.
So I haven't finished the last chapter in this section yet, but I get the gist of it. And it feels to me like some sort of Augustinian thing. She seems to see the world periphery as a kind of embryo that is a seed that's already been placed by God, and it's working itself out over whatever.
Yeah, that's good, Bill, because I felt that too, and that I started reading about Augustine's seminal reasons. That's his category. I think it's already in the Confessions. And what we have there are the seeds of the future. And it's all of time up until the eschaton, when there's this kind of leap. And she's suggesting there's going to be a kind of leap too, because the resurrection kind of foreshadows that leap. But there is the whole Aeonic World-Periphery, and I think I make some comments on that. On I think this fellow Wood was his name, wrote a good book on Augustine's Cosmology of History in terms of the seminal reasons. And of course, it's many ways Platonic too. These forms are entelechies, and they have prior conditions. That's one of the things that comes up. They don't kick in. Certain aspects of the essence entelechies can't kick in until certain things are realized in the finished world. The world has to become capable, has potential for this kind of actualization in order for these higher levels, this epigenesis, to occur.
Right. So to me, it's almost like what she's saying is like because I went to the section in this last chapter, you start talking about individuals and world essence or something. And it's the world essence that works out all of the how it responds to circumstances, and because it's a holistic concept. It's an essence for the world, not just for the entities in the world, but the entire world, right, as it's realized at that point. And and that's part of its seminal aspect.
No, I think that's right. I think that she wants to say that there is the universe is a universe, universum, and all converges. That's what the universe was supposed to be originally. That we'd all talking basically the same thing, and bringing it all together. But that's what I think that was her understanding of the cosmos.
I found that quote that you're talking about, and that really struck me last time as something that kind of makes this more concrete. And I think Augustine is talking about how creation was in 7 days, but part of what God did was to implant these seminal reasons that will come to fruition in the future. And so, well, this is what Henry Wood said. I thought it was stated really well. They are the reasons distinguishing objectively the things that are to be from mere possibilities never to be actuated. They are seminal, not seeds, yet following the analogy of seeds, because impressed on matter, they determine its potency to what is to exist and exclude all other possibilities, as the virtue of the seed determines matter to this species and excludes that. And that's one way of answering the question of how is the fertilized egg going to be Einstein? The fertilized egg is not going to be a frog.
No.
And it could be Einstein.
No.
So somehow that Einstein, and that's what it's trying to describe, I think.
No. And the and all the layers of potentiality in that picture are terribly important, because for that fetus to come up with the Fifth Symphony or come up with relativity theory or something like that, there are all sorts of levels of potentiality would have to be actualized, and they can't be actualized unless more fundamental potentialities are actualized. So that's why she can talk about the potentiality. You know, there's in the what you can say of that child that she is capable of writing the greatest symphony ever written. And that's true. You know, it's capable. If she has everything that Einstein has, she's capable of doing that, you know. But what are the potentialities that have to be actuated for that to be true? And so it's that ultimately it's her potentialities. That says she has to actuate them. Although there are extrinsic necessary conditions, she has to have teachers. They are the what she calls, I forget what the Wirkung's potence or something like that. Just like one of that, she has so many levels, and now the analysis of potentiality, I think, is one of the really, you know, great orchestrations she pulls off. But you know, like the famous example of the avalanche in the Alps, when someone sneezes, the sneeze cannot be said to have the potentiality to destroy that village that the avalanche caused, but nevertheless it was a factor, a causal factor. But the snow, with its power, needed, in order to destroy the village, it needed to be actuated extrinsically. And freedom and the self-actualization stands transcendent. Something like the sneeze stands transcendent to all the levels, natural levels of potentiality. The young and aging agent has to do things, has to create herself in a certain way to come up with the Fifth Symphony, or come up with Guernica, or come up with whatever that we admire, being a saint, being a moral hero. And so she has all these levels of potentiality, and potentialities which themselves are agents after a certain stage, but they can't be actualized until the person self-actuates.
Isn't there also a distinction to be made, though, between the potentiality for being and potentiality for doing? Like the fertilized egg is not potentially a frog, but it is potentially a toddler. And that's to be distinguished from the fertilized egg is a being that potentially could speak, or could write poetry, or could speak German, all those things.
Yes.
And so, and there are lots, that's just maybe an example. how complex that can become as soon
No.
as you start talking about this.
No. Yeah, I think that's and that I don't know how well she or where she actually handles that, but even with the infant becoming a toddler, and I take a toddler to be able to walk a little bit, that there has to be some level of agency there, self-actuation, but it's quite different than learning German, or quite different than becoming a person who risks her life to save another person, But it's certainly that the infant's developing speech organs or a tongue, a brain. There's no freedom involved there. There's no agency involved in the sense that we're pointing to it doing.
I'd like to ask a question about Conrad-Martius's cosmology. So the typical cosmology that we think of today is something like a closed universe. It's a closed system. Now, things like the Big Bang or the what's it called? The vacuum. I can't remember what it's called. But anyway, the vacuum something. Question that. But she suggests something, and I'm going to read something from page 187, which made me think what I'm going to say. And I'll read it. It's on the top of the page. You can find it if you want. And it says, the dynamism of the absolute absence is the world center, is one of sinking out of actual existence towards an absolute beginning, out of which from a reverse perspective, everything first originates. It is the womb out of which everything comes to be through the actualization of the absolute future. Now, I'm not sure what the absolute future is.
Are you reading something, love? Are you reading something?
I am.
Can you tell me what is that something that you've written, or is that?
No, that's your book, Jim.
Here,
Page
187.
187.
Oh, what page is it?
187.
I'm sorry, I didn't. I think I have to read it. Maybe we should do that again.
187.
Okay. So where are we reading from?
It's at the very last sentence of the first paragraph.
Okay.
And it says the dynamism
Good.
of the absolute absence, which I say is the world center, is one of sinking out of actual existence towards an absolute beginning, out of which, from a reverse perspective, everything first originates.
Okay.
It is the womb out of which everything comes to be through the actualization of the absolute future.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I don't understand large parts of that,
Uh-huh.
but it made me think of something. Of course, she's writing this about the time that Heidegger is writing things like the origin of what's it called? The origin of art, works of art is what it's called, and other similar writings, which he talks about the earth or the soil in which the tree's roots are extending. And it's this point is this dark, undifferentiated, unknown space from which things just emerge. And so I'm wondering whether this world center is like a wormhole. It's like this thing that out of which something, we don't know what, something that's maybe not even part of the Ionic periphery that has this order that can emerge and go into a new aeon, a new form. And it's like this place where God, if you like, can enter and recreate and create, in the use her terms of the word, not as a generation.
No. Well, Bill, I think if I get this right, I think what's going on here is the major distinction, if you want, between essence and existence. That she has a very robust theory of creation. And creation is bringing out of nothing. And she distinguishes it from generation, where something comes out of a pre-existing substance. And what exists is identical in substance with that which is brought forth. Creation from nothing Now, it's not obvious. This is the mystery of the Abrahamic religions. But God creates out of nothing. And the whole Ionic world-periphery, which is soaked with the actualities and potential actualities of all shapes, all forms conceivable, that are able to be part of nature, all of those, including wormholes, and all these remarkable concepts of physics are going to have to be there. But that something is it all is what she's talking about here. And the vehicle of that is what we call time. The time is the vehicle for existence. And there, where she makes the connection with modern physics is the quanta of the subatomic elements that seem to come into being and pass out of being. If those are the building blocks of all of nature, she's making contact with that theory here, but she's not looking for it in finished being. It's in the potential being of the Aeonic world-periphery. And so if there's no future and there's no past, because we're dealing with the eternal and the infinite being as the source. It's ever new. All those epithets she assigns to it, it's the beginning from out of which, from a reverse, everything first originates. Everything. It is the womb out of which everything comes to be through actualization of an absolute future. But strictly,
And they say she uses the word absolute because it's not a temporal future. It's already there in some sense.
right. That's right. It's not a temporal future, and it includes all futures.
So let me say something.
Could it be called like virtuality? This aspect?
Yeah, I think so. It's in itself, it isn't virtual. That we have to understand what perspective we're looking at. She's shifting back and forth, but the source of the actuation, the source of the time of the absolute, it's absolutely absent in the sense it's not part of what is actualized. So that's its absolute absence. So the dynamism is that the now, which is actuated, sinks out of existence. As the cylinder goes around the slice, and so sinks out of towards an absolute beginning. Well, nothing is lost in that absolute beginning. For that absolute source of being, there is no loss of being. There cannot be. If it existed, then somehow it cannot not have been. That's what I think she's saying here.
I'm sorry, Jim. Are we still talking about what you think she's saying on page 187?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I think I'm talking about that.
I think it also applies to the diagram and our section on Aeonic space-time as well, in so many ways, including I just want to say a couple things about this diagram, for instance. In D-Site, it appears twice. Okay, it appears on page 203, where there's one difference between these two instances of her book D-Site. It's on page 203 and also on page 238. Okay, so here's the difference. On page 203, the little what do you call that? Like the ball inside the other two, right? This one is marked E, the letter E for Erda, the Earth. And on page 238, it's Welt for world.
Okay.
here's that one.
Yep, yep.
So that's the one difference, and that might seem insignificant, and again, not to read too much into it, but to read the right amount into it. In the first one, she's describing, it's in the section called the Aristotelian,
Yes, that's right. That's what
conception of space and time.
Mhm.
And then in the second one, it's in a section called it's more about the discontinuous. There's our word that Jim was talking about. It here. It's in German. It's Actualizer Renda. What is it?
Yes.
Actualizer.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
it's hard to see, but it's it's more like specifically her concept of things coming in, into actualization from this, from the, I don't know, from like the other side, which is, I think, in some respects, the Aeonic
Yes.
World-Periphery. But then there's also the Apeirisha realm site to consider. She's not talking about that in here. That's more a topic in Der Raum. But it's interesting to bear in mind these two categories of like an other side or whatever, a space-time that's different than just the Peirisha, Pyric metric space-time that we're empirically familiar with.
Yes.
So that's one thing I wanted to say about that, and not to cut off conversation about that, but I just wanted to mention that. And another thing, the last section of the book is an excursus. There's two excursuses, and the second one is called Temporal Clairvoyance, a term that has appeared previously in this work and in other places in Conrad-Martius. She talks about this term clairvoyance, and it's a term that was used quite often at the time. This is around earlier, late 1800s, and then like the early decades of the 20th century. There are different schools of psychology being founded, and what we today would call like occult powers or whatever, mystic modes or whatever, were somewhat divided into passive and active ones. Like psychokinesis and stuff would be like active ones, whereas something like clairvoyance and telepathy, these were accepted by many of these schools. Now, we might have a different attitude towards these things today, but they served a certain function in different contexts. And one context that I found recently, just in the past few months, that I've been getting really, really into, to understand the concept in particular of ether, but other concepts that Conrad-Martius is employing, is that of Rudolf Steiner, a student of Brentano. He's in the circuit here. I'm not sure about their contact exactly, but Steiner and certain students developed this concept of the ether, which really comes from the what might be called like proto-phenomenology of Goethe. And of course, the Goethean kind of holism is very prevalent in the paradigm of Conrad-Martius. We can see this especially in like Die Seele der Pflanze, the soul of the plant, which is part of her real ontology. So there's a few. I'll just hold up the books to show you a couple things that I found especially interesting from the Steinerian world. This guy, Gunther, what is it? Wachsmuth?
Wachsmuth.
Yeah, Wachsmuth. He was an important figure in early anthroposophy. This book deals with the idea of ether a lot like the way Conrad-Martius does. And then I found this one, towards the phenomenology of the etheric world. These figures are different scientists, right? This guy, Poppelbaum, was, he's an important anthroposophist, but Poppelbaum, here, I'll show you his name again, is an anthropologist, and he has another book called Man and Animal. It goes into this stuff very deeply. anyway, these are just really interesting things to check out. Maybe I'll circulate some of the books that I found. There's a lot of interesting diagrams that have a close affinity with what we're talking about. So they're coming from Steiner, and that brings me to this. In his just to tie it to one of his works in interdisciplinary astronomy, and you can find these online, transcripts of them with the diagrams. You can even find a podcast that I've been listening to where someone reads these. And in interdisciplinary astronomy, a lot of what he's doing is tying together two sciences, astronomy, and he's talking about like the transitions from the Keplerian and Copernican worldview to the modern, astronomy and embryology. So a lot of what we find in Conrad-Martius when she deals with the concepts of entelechy from Driesch, and in like developmental anthropology and people like Haeckel and von Uexküll and figures like this, when we're talking about sea urchins or morphology and embryology, there's this like biological component to entelechy, or a biological application that you find prevalent in a number of thinkers we've heard of, who are translated and who are discussed by Merleau-Ponty and others we've heard of. And then there's the concept of entelechy that is more like, space-time theoretical physics. That is a lot like the stuff about the etheric world in this stuff. So anyway, it's just a point I wanted to connect all this stuff together with the Steiner people and this concept of clairvoyance. Now I've translated this last section of Die Zeit as well, called Temporal Clairvoyance, and I'll circulate this for us to check out. It's I think, like the Begriff der Potenz, it's also very very helpful for understanding what this stuff is, and understanding how, like, in here she talks about the imaginoid potencies again, which are coming from, as we saw in Jim's presentation in the book, coming from the theoretical biology, like Driesch. There's the spermatoid and the imaginoid, concepts of potency, and she's using them to help explain like where this is coming from. So anyway, I'm going to definitely circulate this stuff as well.
Good. I think that I think I get the drift, Randy, that a lot of this, what we come up with here, and I think what must be said in all fairness, that it's easier to get into reading Steiner or any of the other names you mentioned than to read Conrad-Martius. And in other words, we could take it's a difficult road to get to the Aeonic World-Periphery than it would be to read a book on parapsychology and someone postulating this ethereal dimension in which we can participate. And so that being said, nevertheless, it's kind of a tribute, it seems to me, to the largeness of her mind, that she didn't dismiss things, so that there were, the world is a big place, and the earth is a big place, and there are phenomena that we can't account for, and unless we can dismiss things as rubbish, but maybe at our peril, and I think for us on this side of the pond, William James is a good moral and intellectual example. He took seriously this stuff, and read it carefully, and when it made sense to him, and when he himself was familiar with the data, say like parapsychology, or some of the phenomena of say psychoanalysis, early psychoanalysis, or this fellow by the name of Meyer, and some of these weird things we call seances and things. We can dismiss those things as con artists, shysters, and these things like that. But if one has reason to lend credibility to them, then one is motivated to not dismiss them. So but the point now is, so that she's a philosopher, and some of the paranormal phenomena for her, and of course Gerda Walter, her friend, had to be treated with some sort of. She was the founder of a parapsychological association. I think Gerda Walter was at least one of the founders. So that was a tradition, a theme, and which I don't think that she is, going to be read by many people who do that sort of thing. She's hard enough for people who spend their life doing philosophy to read, but just to go back to the first diagram that Randy referred to, where it's not world but Erde, Earth, the E. Though she's talking about Aristotle, and this is a tradition that lasted quite a long time. I don't know how, Randy would know that better than I. But what we have in, I think it was C.S. Lewis said, when we look up the heavens, say we in the 20th century, we see glowing dead bodies, that are out of reach. But when the medieval looked up at the sky, he saw a party. He saw the heavenly bodies, as we still call them, were embodied angels, and the angels were accounted for Aristotle's thesis that these celestial spheres never stopped, and they controlled, and they kept going on forever. And there was the residual kind of the I can't read that, Randy, I'm sorry.
I hope it'll come into focus in one sec. It's just what you're referring to with
Wow.
the T.S. Eliot, the one dance. Where is it? Here it is. It's sorry, it's not coming into focus.
Well, she has that wonderful text from Eliot's Four Quartets about this the still point of the turning world. That's precious for her. That's I think I quote that here.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful text. That's just worth looking at, because so much can be of that diagram is made sense of from that text. We'll have to find the page for that for those. So I don't have an index. So yeah, I think I do have an index of names. So if you look at that, it should show up there. But the point I'm trying to make is that when there was once something like philosophical cosmology existed up until, say, the 16th century, before, we're blessed with Descartes, but Descartes reduced matter to a kind of homogeneous stuff, which was extended, and there was not any. There was no stand on either epigenesis or preformism or evolution or whatever development. There weren't those discussions hadn't gone on in any detail, but they were frequently interspersed with a kind of quasi-mystical language of marginal, often heretical for the church figures. But the main tradition, though, that she's in the book on time she's appealing to is Aristotle. One of the first Aristotelian positions, which is saying bodies are not in space, bodies make the space in which they thrive. It's that early distinction that she accounts for for space, not as a pre-existent Newtonian space, but bodies are the way the very being of bodies creates elbow room for themselves to exist. So she makes a verb out of the word space, spacing, but we use spacing, on the typewriter keyboards, it's making empty space. But Räumen in German can be used for cleaning up your room or making a clearing on your desk so that you can live on your desk and it's not chaos. And that was one of her major arguments used from a lot of things, but especially her analysis of what space was for physicists, that you didn't have an empty space. This is the great legacy of Newton. It lasted, it still lasts, it seemed to me, in most discussions of space. And what more recent physics, and certainly Conrad-Martius, that space is more Aristotelian. You understand space by saying what kind of being, and she would give simple examples that fire had to rise, and that's why there was a space. The space it made was by fires rising, and heavier substances, they fell to the center of the earth. That was their space. They had their proper place. Everything had its proper place, and that's the kind of space of the universe in which we live. So that's the first Aristotelian point. The second point is that I already mentioned that beyond the world, the visible world, there was a more fundamental spiritual world of the heavenly bodies, and the heavenly bodies were not just an aesthetic category; they were a metaphysical category. There were pure spirits. Now, the pure spirit was a residue from Aristotle. Didn't have angels. He had all of the spheres in love with God. The first principle, the first cause of the universe was a final cause, that for the sake of which everything was undertaken. That fundamental object of desire for everything in the universe, not only humans, not only even animals or plants, but rocks. And in the medievals, when they took over this heavenly body motion, they ascribed it to angels. Now, the category of angels comes, of course, out of the Bible, but they had a whole development through Plato and Aristotle and Plotinus and so forth of kinds of beings which were pure forms. And this goes, they weren't like seminal reasons that Bill was pointing to. They were spiritual beings. They were conscious beings, but they weren't in time. Their temporality was radically different. They weren't in time. And so they had to develop, well, how do they know things, and what does it mean for them to know things? Well, they had a rich, amazing a priori knowledge of the world and everything in it. And everything was kind of, we might want to say, unfortunately, pre-programmed. They knew everything already in a way that there was to know about nature and about one another. But they still had a ways of communicating. And somehow they were behind the heavenly bodies in motion. So this is kind of and that's this space in which the angels were, because they weren't bodily, but where their agency moved the bodies around, had to be heterogeneous to the space that we experienced. And so this is kind of the image, or the collection of images with her Aeonic World-Periphery, that you have then you have this other dimension of the universe, which is very familiar to well into I think it's Pascal that says that, but that C.S. Lewis borrows from him on this, that you look up into the sky and you see this amazing party, the celebration of creation. And they're behind these visible heavenly bodies, which we didn't have astronomical information about them very much, but we did have their regularity, their consistency, their reliability, quasi moral categories, but quasi divine categories, and they were associated then with these pure spirits. Now, she is not transposing that view into her view, but there's some symmetry, because the essence entelechies have also a non-temporal, non-passing existence. They don't depreciate, they don't wear out. They're simply there as the number 4. It can't be erased, as the square root can't be erased, as the idea of goodness can't be erased. They have an eternity, but they're personal beings, quasi-personal beings. For Aristotle, for her, the essence entelechies are the self-actualizing agency of the universe. But they're not persons. But in some sense, in her own cosmology, they're more than persons because persons emerge out of them. But I guess that's all the way of saying when we look at again, this visible picture, we have to realize that what we're talking about with the periphery is not in space, not in time, is not extended. But all that we perceive comes out of that. And it's in a realm of potency, but a self-actualizing potency. And that goes back to the real ontology. That's real things come into being from out of themselves. There's a soul dimension, which is very much part of the non-soul being of paleontology, that paleontology deals with, even the non-conscious history of nature and so forth. So Bill, does that help with that couple sentences you shared with us? Because time, you see, then is the additional factor in the Aeonic World-Periphery. When she did her 1927 article on time, and this is a position that Yankelevich and Lavelle still argue for, that the existence comes out of this time experience. It's only in the present that things are real. But what is the present? Is the present vanishing? Or is it, and this is still a problem to understanding, if you ask me what Husserl's lebendige Gegenwart about is living present, in what sense is that present passing, which is our experience of the passing present or the vital present? It seems to me he has something not passing, a non-passing presence, which doesn't itself pass. It's not present in the sense of a passing now. So she wants to, in the original Time articles, it's a long articles. She had the actuality of being deriving from the moment. In a certain sense, we were in the present, but that present was not ours to hold on to. It was constantly a giving of the gift of our being. She felt that she came to reject that position. She felt if that were so, God could not be said to be the creator, because he would always be working at it. It would never be something that existed in itself and by itself. Well, now she comes up with 40 years later, she comes up with a theory of in which nature is a creation, and to be a fully robust creation, it has to be some sense self-creating. It's another thesis of Lavelle. And radically self-creating, that means it even accounts for the temporality of the world as we experience it. And God's not at work in that. That somehow itself is the effect of the Aeonic World-Periphery. And so that's the purpose of that now. And then she ties that in with quantum physics. Those are existential quanta. The whole universe, however, is at the still point of the turning world. It's now. But that the source of that now is not within the cosmos, strictly speaking. It's transcendent to the cosmos. Even though in the case of Conrad-Martius, the Aeonic World-Periphery is the immediate bestowal of the now and the flux. I'm not sure it really works, but it's her position. She really wants a very robust notion of creation, and she robbed, the radical existential sense of the fragility and radical contingency of human experience in terms of a now that is always passing, and she gives puts it in nature, and it's not that contingent. Nature itself bestows it as part of God's creation of a world in itself, which is capable of generating creatures which generate themselves.
Now, consistent with the creatio ex nihilo, in the 1927 D Site essay on time, she refers to the now coming from, being the knife edge of time, coming from and passing on to the nothing, das Nichts.
Yes.
And of course, she's very much a reader of, very influenced by such figures as Jakob Boehme and these figures, Eckhart, Aristotle, like this.
Somewhat, yeah. Okay.
So well, the term nothing, in like the Christian context, but also in the metaphysical context that she's drawing on, doesn't of course mean nothingness, but rather maybe the superabundance, this kind of.
Well, yeah, but that's something else. Well, that would be the the Buddhist or the in some we hear that in Eckhart too. Absolutely right. But it's not the no thingness. It's not the indefinability, the non-graspability, non-conceptualizability. This is more the Orthodox creationist view that God creates from nothing, and this is not a form of generation or pantheism, where what exists are little godlets deriving from God, but everything that exists does derive from God, but they aren't God. This is trying to argue in the most robust way that I know, perhaps, for creation being radically in itself, a genuine being in itself, and then that way it's in utter harmony with atheism and modern secularism and what almost all my friends agree is the utter truth. That we're come out of chaos and that we're it's a random deal and we don't know where in the hell we're going. We don't know where we're going from there's not everything is the world, and physics is our best source for finding out what that means. No, the world is a creature, even though it is the source of existential quanta.
We're talking about the influence because I don't know if you mentioned, I think she was also influenced by a nun, Saint Teresa from the Cross, because this is when I was reading about Edith Stein. So she was converted to Catholicism because when she was visiting Conrad-Martius, she found the book of Teresa on her shelf, right? So that I think also was the influence on her. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think she wasn't Catholic, but if Edith Stein would have handed her a copy of the Spanish mystics, I'm sure she would have read it seriously, and you're absolutely right. Of course, the creationist metaphysics is basic for those mystics. Absolutely right. But I mean, we have texts in the New Testament, and this is the one of my favorite ones is Ephesians 1:4. It was the most difficult philosophically to work out, but I called you by name before the creation of the world. So so we have an identity according to that text, which is not result of the individuation of the universe, or of our intersubjectivity, or of our ethos, or of our culture. There's a sense of identity prior to all that. Now she rejects that view later. I think I talk about that in there, but she thinks that in our unique satiety and our uniqueness as persons, that also derives from the Aeonic World-Periphery. And she critiques, the kind of fascination with individuality and personalism. So that's to me, and I wrote, I think Randy passed that around. I wrote my critique of that view of hers. But in any case, it's a further radicalization, it seems to me, of wanting to account for the world being a creature, but a creature in the most robust sense as a being in itself and by itself. And even the actuality, the facticity, the radical contingency that everything is not nothing, is everything is nothing were it not for God. That is self-derived for her from the Aeonic World-Periphery's motion.
I want to get back to some phenomenology. So if I understand it, at least part of her motivation for thinking of this, aside from her Christian background or theological background, is this notion that's introduced in quantum mechanics in the 20th century. This idea of that Heisenberg speaks of as possibilities of the wave functions that they exist, whether tangled or not, and they exist as possibilities, and they don't become actualized. This is especially true in entanglement, where you have a mix of even contradictory states. They don't become actualized until they are interacted with in some way, or by an observer or something from, quote unquote, the outside world that collapses the wave functions. And so this, as I understand, is what Jim, you keep referring to as discontinuous, the discontinuity, this going from these possibilities to actualities. And it's called discontinuous because there doesn't seem to be any continuous movement from the possibilities to the actualities. It seems to occur, at least in quantum theory, spontaneously, yes, and actually is a leap, a Kierkegaardian leap, from one state to another state, and without any intervening or even any logic for that matter. It's an illogical process, actually. And there's no rationality to it. And so my question is, phenomenologically, so I got that understanding from quantum mechanics, but I don't know what people thought about this prior to quantum mechanics, because I never encountered it. In other words, did people, of course, understood what potential was and possibility was? Did they think that moving from, let's say, thinking physically, a billiard ball being held above a table, it has potential energy? Did they think that it moving from potential energy to kinetic energy was discontinuous in some sense, the way that she thinks of it? I'm not sure they did. Anyway, I'm asking a phenomenological question. What is this sense? Because she ties it up, or you do anyway, and no, she does too, later on in speaking of the essentially an existential state of mankind, which does interest me. Anyway, that's, I don't know if I'm making it clear my question.
Oh, Bill, my hearing is so poor. Could somebody put together what Bill's question is? Because I really didn't, my hearing is so poor. I'm sorry to say.
Let me try. I may have been not speaking directly into the microphone. So my question has to do with this notion of discontinuity, which I take as moving from possibility to actuality. That in quantum mechanics, this is sort of a discontinuous process, if you like. But prior to quantum mechanics, what did people think about that? And is this a phenomenological or a thematic or cognitive notion that is discontinuous? I'm looking for the phenomenological basis for this discontinuity.
Okay. Because someone else want to phrase it for me, because I think I know it. What anybody want to raise the question in a different way or say it again, just to help me out? Because
I think what Bill's asking is, like, what is this discontinuity, the break, right? The discontinuity that we find in the collapse of the wave function in quantum mechanics for instance, in that context. But maybe like, you know, in Conrad-Martius, what is the ontological, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, but are you asking about like maybe the connection between like what she calls the ontological dynamic, or you know, Jim has the section, the ontological dynamic.
Well, there's the big section, I have to look and find it in the sections we just read, where Jim talks about where Conrad-Martius is very concerned about being able to account for how this discontinuity, which takes place in the Aeonic periphery, the world periphery, that's discontinuous, and yet we experience it as continuous. And so she wants to talk about how this is possible, how the discontinuity can be seen as continuous.
So is this the discontinuity of phylogenesis, of evolutionary theory?
The discontinuity takes place moment by moment, where
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think that how the phenomenological basis for that is the whole notion of time in some sense as a flow, a stream of consciousness. At least that's how we access it. And we have what we call the present moment. Well, it's fascinated William James. And the question arose, well, if there is such a thing as the present moment, can I grab it? How long is it? Because as soon as I direct my attention to the moment, it's gone. So there is this sense of when and where is now. The moment, the whole language of ephemerality is tied to this experience that nothing lasts. And this was the basis of Bergson, is trying to show, yes, but we experience time as now, as perduring, as having a duration. We look at someone, that person is there, even though she's there now, she's there now, she's there now, she's there now. And each moment is different from the rest. And if she were to vanish, if she were to die, if she were to be teletransported, you know, you say, well, that was at 4:31. This is 4:32, and somewhere in between there, she's no longer here, and I don't know what happened to her. And we have this sense of the evanescence, the transitoriness, the non-graspability of now. And that's what she's appealing to, even though Puss would say, and she would say, well, the reason we give it duration and think we've got a hold of it as some thing having duration is because Husserl would say we have an identity synthesis, you know, because we have never the now without a retention of the now that just passed and a protension of the now that's to come. So we extend the now to that, and so we give it a duration, and we're able to, by looking at something, to say, well, it lasts throughout my gaze. But we can analyze that experience, and we see it's a temporary experience in the sense that we find in that duration divisible, not divisible in any strict sense, but moments. And what's funny about the moment is precisely it isn't able to be grasped, but it's always anew and it's always vanishing. And so she's holding that out of which it comes cannot be itself vanishing. It itself has a kind of non-ephemeral duration. In fact, it doesn't even have a duration. It is an nunc stans. Aristotle himself had this analysis of time, that we experience time as a nunc fluens, a flowing now, and yet in our in our perception, there is an abiding now, a nunc stans. Well, the
And
nunc,
then isn't the point then that the nunc stans is not something that lasts, but on the other hand, it's always there.
yes, that's
And,
it.
and actually time feels that way. It feels like the present is real and it's always the same present, even though when we look at it, we know that it's never the same.
And that's gone. It's never retrievable.
And yet at the same time, it's always the same.
Yeah.
And that's a question that I had when she talks about the discontinuity of now or the quantization of now. Is this what she's getting at when she's talking in those terms?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. No. And where before that was a immediately theological topic in 27, she felt that it was shortchanging God as a creator. She felt that God never got finished. God was never able to create something because that something didn't have any duration. And so if everything was, I think what's important is to see, I think this is, and I don't think this is an easy thing to answer. I don't think anybody's got all the answers to this for sure, but that we connect being with what's now. When we use the word what's actual, what really is as being, it's now, it's actual. And we say it's present. That there's those few terms, they kind of have a kind of a homology with one another. You can't think of one without the other. And yet, and then of course, Sartre's book and Heidegger's book, being and time, being and nothingness, are talking about this. I think their springboard is this fundamental experience. And the image that she uses, and it's not hers, I don't think, alone, but the knife edge presence of the now. That it doesn't have any breadth. Well, of course it has breadth. Of course it has breadth because you have the retentions and protensions. Well, but that now, as soon as you refer to it, is a new now.
Except at the same time, when we're talking about presence, like especially the way Lavelle talks about it, that knife edge is at the same time contains everything. Yes. And I think Lavelle says this even more strongly, that this so-called knife edge is always the same. It's all, and there's a sense in which we're always in exactly the same presence. Presence is something that, and how you reconcile this with the flow of time is the crazy impossible paradox. Yeah. And yet it seems inescapable that this presence really is always the same. And even that it's the same presence everywhere for everyone, and that we're all somehow in it.
Well, that's, and if you translate that, what it refers to as being, then it's more obviously true.
And that what we're really talking about is the presence of being.
Yes.
And that we're always in that, and that in a fundamental sense, that in a sense is incomprehensible, can't change. It's just being, it's just presence.
Yeah, but then you have that person whom you loved who died. Then you have that experience, exactly. It's gone, and so we cannot deny the either horn of the dilemma, so to speak.
Exactly.
But it is for the philosophers we mentioned, and most of whom we know that are any good, this is the core issue. And she displaces it from creationism, mediates creationism with a robust self-creating nature.
Well, so if you look at I'm sorry, there's a genealogy. You mentioned the knife edge metaphor. What influences Heidegger so much in the philosophy of time is what Augustine has to say about it. And the term, the knife edge of time, can be found early on in Augustine. And then Augustine, in turn, is drawing on earlier sources. And of course we can see like, you know, the presence of like Heraclitus, you know, but in particular in the syntax of time, Peter Manchester ties the Heideggerian Augustinian line of thought about this phenomenology of time back to pseudo-Architas from Iamblichus. And there's this figure that's a kind of like proto Husserlian diagram, like in inner time consciousness, there's this triangular diagram, right? Or and so some of the authors who have written about Iamblichus, Sambursky, and Pines, they have written, they've drawn it out like this, like time might be like, you know, coming out as two rays from a point, in trying to explain what this semeion, this sign of pseudo Architas is, or maybe it's like on a conveyor belt like this. So they have these diagrams, but then Manchester uses two rays. And so there's a fundamental discontinuity and double continuity, just like in Husserl, a double continuity and a two-dimensionality of time. And he uses Heraclitus to look at what Architas is saying. And so this is from Sambursky and I think it's Pines. It's Israeli. I'm not sure how to say it exactly, but there's this diagram where here's the now, here's the past and the future, and it looks like this. And you can see how this is a lot like the Husserlian diagram, but Manchester uses this where there's a fundamental discontinuity. And so the knife edge has that breaking point. And Plotinus also has this word classis, breaking. Manchester points these out. So the idea of discontinuity that the section begins with, the foundation of the discontinuous motion of time that we're talking about today, right, is also connected to the earlier stuff, of course, about the real ontology of time, early on in the book, like page 34, and the ontological dynamic and the real ontology of passing time, right? And I wonder if we might want to, you know, I know we don't have a lot of time left, but it might be good. We could have done this in the beginning, but maybe we can look at that first page, because in the very first paragraph there, I feel like a lot of the sentence.
What page is that, Randy?
Well, page 173, and I can just share so we can read along, just to look at a couple sentences here. I think is really important. So I'll start just reading a little bit here. We have at various stages of the presentation, but especially in the discussion of passing time, had occasion to see how for Conrad-Martius time's motion is not dependent on empirical processes of change, but on an existential motion, i.e. on the ontological foundational process of empirical nature. We have seen this process described as the progress of being quanta, or a constantly renewed transition from not yet being to actual being. It is a constant falling into nothingness, as well as a constant renewal. Before we begin our final and most important speculation, some epistemological clarifications are in order. Okay, so I think that was helpful, and I think that these next sentences are especially interesting because they give us a superimposition of real time, or at least this is how I'm picturing it, a superimposition of real time on transcendental time, or something like that.
That's important, yeah.
Yeah. So it says, it continues here, the noetic relationship between the transcendental motion, the passing of time from out of the future into the past, as well as the advancing into the future, the transcendental motion, and the real motion of time is different from the ontological connection between these same two-time motions. So just to pause for a moment, because I think the next sentence is also very important, but just so we're clear, this is an epistemological clarification of the distinction between these two kinds of time that are in a noetic relationship, and on the other hand, the ontological connection between them.
just a pause so that what we have at the noetic there is the two possibilities of what she would call a transcendental time, which in some sense for her is an illusion. Okay, the time, we say that time comes out of the future towards us and goes into the past, or we see ourselves, as we're on the vanguard of time moving into the future. Those are two familiar, but they're transcendental, and for her a pejorative sense, that they don't square with the ontological reality, which is what you're coming to then.
Right. So now here's that. That is, we come to the knowledge of the ontological real advance of time at the place of the present only because we are able to experience flowing time. Without the remembrance of the past and expectation of what is to come, one would find herself in a pure present without the transcendental imaginative flow of time, but she would also be without knowledge of a real temporal motion.
No. But that for her is the problem. That and this was, of course, Husserl's work, and Heidegger edited it on the inner time consciousness.
Well, Edith Stein did, actually. Saint Benedicta of the Cross that we mentioned earlier. Edith Stein did all the work, and then Heidegger came on at the very end.
Yes, that was right. And it wasn't apparently a job very well done, but that's another question.
Yeah.
But the point is that we have it as this point about the transcendental interpretation or transcendental experience of time, is that it's misleading ontologically, and so we have to kind of deconstruct that in order to see the discontinuity of the existential quanta, and that is to see that the moment comes into being seemingly out of nothingness and then falls back into nothingness to be replaced by something, another quanta, and then fall back into nothingness. So, and that I think is partly the interesting point of the T.S. Eliot text too, that he at least he captures that aspect. But then, it gets us to so many issues which she the details of which she doesn't deal, but she had read the Husserl, and Augustine is the main figure there. And Husserl says this is the best description we have, of Augustine, and then Heidegger's involvement in it too. And these are all marvelous analyses. She does talk about a kind of a deeper level of angst. It's not the apprehension of no thingness, of not being able to grab a hold of somethingness as a relationship to the future. No, it's the angst is right at the heart of our experience of time, as it's not ours to have. Time is a gift and constantly eluding us at the same time. And I think somewhere along that she talks about a patient of Jasper's, who's a psychiatrist, that only lived without a future. He only lived in the past, and another one was only able to live with this discrete notion of time. That would have been, I think, that would have been pure torture. So, anyhow.
Well, before we wrap up totally, I just want to bring up another topic, because I've been a reader of this work for a while, and one thing I find really fascinating.
Longer than I have.
Yeah, right. Aeonically, I've been for the womb, right? There's this word that appears once in the text on page 178 in our reading, and so this is my opportunity to ask you about it. And it's in Die Zeit. It's where it comes from, and you refer to the location there as well. But so on 178, we're talking about Aristotle and his world-periphery, and there's this phrase, and then I got really into Aristotle over the years, and have read the physics, the metaphysics, and on the heavens in particular, with this as my framework. which this is a great framework if you get into Aristotle. So there's this term transcendent concrete, which is basically the German as well, in die Zeit. Conrad-Martius believes, this is on page 178, that this transcendent concrete, which is the ethereal world periphery, is perhaps the basic conception of the entire Aristotelian philosophy.
Oh, wow. Mhm.
Yeah, and I like the way you put it there. And you know, Jim, you mentioned, like, you know, you wrote this a long time ago or whatever, and so I know it's like it's not the easiest thing to get right back into the same you know, mentality when you wrote something, even just something you wrote last week. You know, you were all programmed up with it at the time. But I've been trying to square this with on the one hand, the prime mover in Aristotle, which is here the world periphery, the ethereal world periphery, or maybe they're a little bit different, but my point is to distinguish this kind of stuff, like the eternal circular motion of the heavens, on the one hand, from the prote hule. So the Prima Materia, you know, this is obviously in Conrad-Martius, in this work, in this book, it's explained as being very important for the dimension of potency represented by hyletic being,
That's right.
of which all material things participate.
No.
Right, but things also participate in that prime etheric, maybe called the or ethericias in that one diagram.
Mhm.
Right, so so these are antipodes. These are two poles of one form of analysis going on here. And so the sentence kind of suggests in a way that they're identified, but they don't have to be the same thing. They could be like, you know, in that important dialectical relationship, you know, like an important bond or relation between them. That could be the ultimate Aristotelian motif for Conrad-Martius. But I've just, you know, I've been thinking about it a lot, because if we have this robust concept of an ethereal world periphery in Conrad-Martius that is so similar to so many interesting discussions out there about ether in theoretical physics and anthroposophy, etc. You know, the transcendent concrete idea seems somewhat unique to Conrad-Martius. I mean, not the protehule, like that's out there, of course, that's, you know, that's classic Aristotle for you, and it's all over. But this idea of transcendental or a transcendent concrete, you know, could have so many applications in speculation about, like, you know, theoretical physics type things. But it should also fit into the whole discussion of hyletic substantiality. But so in particular, the footnote leads us to pages 176, 177. And so I've translated those pages as well. And I'll share that with our group over email. But yeah, the word is, where is it? It's transcendent concrete, you know, it's, so can you help me, like, how does transcendent concrete, which is, it says, the ethereal world periphery, how does that be perhaps the most, the basic conception of the entire Aristotelian philosophy?
Well, I'm not sure, but let me read it. I think the sentence before, but metaphysically considered, there are no spatial places already for the motion, because the motion creates its own places. And I think that's important. That's an Aristotelian theme, you know, that fire and bodies don't move through empty space, but they create as a condition for their being whatever they are. And the entelechy, one way of thinking of this transcendent concrete, the transcendent's clear. It's not part of the world. It's beyond, it's and over and beyond and below the world. That transcendent means both above and below in her kind of poetics here, spatial poetics. But and we have to remember that even though the essence entelechies are transcendent and they're forms, entelechy it's the form, it's the form to be actualized, and in itself, its potential. Nevertheless, it has its own kind of hule, its own kind of potentiality. The essence entelechies have entelechial potency. It's already in that, and that means the concreteness of being here and now, and this and that and that. So so this is not just like the seminal reasons of Augustine, for example, and certainly not the Platonic forms. These have a kind of quote unquote concreteness insofar as they already need, in order to actuate themselves, they need something like the proto-hule. But then the other point, of course, what she's saying is that it's transcendent concrete in the sense that if you saw the world with Conrad-Martius's eyes, you would see, that this transcendent concrete is before your eyes as enabling, as the deeper meaning, as the actualization, as a full account of what you're looking at. Anything you're looking at. That's how I read it.
Thank you.
So what are we going to do next time? As with everything, we do it a little bit, but I'm enjoying the conversations.
Well, I think it'd be interesting. I don't know what
Sally
other
didn't ask any questions today, though. Sally, you haven't said not a word today.
Well, as usual, I'm benefiting greatly from the discussion, and I'm, a little bit subdued because I've missed several weeks because I was out of town.
Well,
And so I'm trying to get back into the discussion, but I will say that listening today has just proved to me that I really have missed a lot, and I'm sorry for that, because as always, I just think that the conversation is so enlightening. So that's what I have to say.
You can find us on YouTube. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment. But so okay, regarding what we're going to doing, I think that the themes that we've been doing and the themes that are coming up, still remaining, have a nice flow to them, such that we've looked at biology very carefully. We've we looked at ontology, we looked at biology, we looked at theoretical physics a little bit, but I think that right now we're bringing Aristotle and this specific motif of an Aristotelian, Kantian, transcendental aesthetic happening here. I think it'd be good to meditate on that a bit more before we get into the sections on the more theological and world historical, cosmological stuff. So we just read 5.1. The next section, if we just take it little section by little section, is Aeonic space-time. And then after that, the cosmology of history, which is I think that's the last section of chapter 5. So I think it would be good to meditate a bit more on the specifically Aeonic space-time by looking at that section. And maybe it'd be fun, since this is actually a pretty short section again, to compare the Aeonic space-time, which is a section title here, to an earlier section title that's very similar, the Epiric space-time, just to contrast these transnatural categories, these different space-times.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be fun, because the theology and the demythologization hermeneutic stuff, I think, is more specifically what the later section in this chapter, and then what the next chapter is more about.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we've gotten a good start, but I'd really like to kind of work through further how she's analyzing or speculating about basically the constitution of time, the different senses of time, and the relationship between the Aeonic World-Periphery and what she calls transcendental experience. And those are all things that at least I certainly feel I'd like to get clearer about. And they also seem to be really at the very center. I think we're really getting at the really very center of her metaphysical outlook. And it's really and it kind of brings everything in the earlier chapters really all flows into this. And then the coming chapter is starting to move out from that and to start to talk about theology and things like that. So I agree with you. This would be a really good part to dwell upon further.
Yeah, and though these are very advanced topics, it's a forgivingly short reading, this 5. So one could just jump in from anywhere. But I think,
or even to really continue with section 5.2, there's so much in there and it brings so much together and it's central. And to me, it's still not entirely clear. It's super interesting, but I'd really like to have more discussion with everyone, especially Jim, about what she's saying here.
Yeah, I mean, this is the Scheinslehre to the Seinslehre, like her doctrine of being is expressed as a transcendental aesthetic, looking critically at Kant and Aristotle and Husserl. I think these are all, big important figures for triangulating her thought.
Very good. Okay, well, thanks for everybody for being here.
Thank you all so much. It's
Good.
just
We'll see you
so
in
interesting.
When is our
couple
next
weeks or
meeting?
3 weeks or something.
Yeah, 2 weeks. So that puts us at about it looks like the 24th. How is that for everybody? September 24.
I have to check. Hold on.
We can confirm over email, but let's check now.
While Jim is checking, I just wanted to point out that I don't know anything about Louis Lavelle, but I just checked on Amazon and almost nothing is translated into English.
Regarding that, Jim can say a few things about the translation projects, and there's some websites where you can find fragments at least translated by the guy who's working on translating Lavelle into books, into English.
Yeah, you're right. Almost nothing has been translated by him.
So Jim,
there is some guy in Australia who's translated some segments, and Jim's working on a translation of
Well, we talked about Lavelle.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's see. If you go to Google, and it just type under Google Louis Lavelle Association or Association. That should bring up the website, and down towards the bottom, it's defunct. Basically, the association is defunct. But Robert Alan Jones, their person from Australia, has translated huge chunks of, and he's going to finish the book, I think the key book on the Act. And but if I get my piece polished a little more, I can send that to Randy to send off. That's a book on reflection, and you'll see there, I think, some, why someone who's interested in phenomenology would be interested in what he's up to. It's but for anybody who is, he has, I'm not sure I know how to say your name, Małgorzata? He has
I will
written.
pronounce it Małgorzata. Małgorzata.
Małgorzata. He wrote a book on holiness. That's how it's translated into English. It was called Quatre Saints, Four Saints. And it's basically, the first part is on holiness, but then he deals with the He deals with Francis of Assisi, Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, and then Francis de Sales as exemplifying. And then his other book in English is called The Error of, or The Dilemma of Narcissus. The French is The Error of Narcissus. I don't know if anything else is translated, unfortunately.
There is one other one, something about Introduction to Ontology, or
Oh, that's right. That's
Yeah.
very important.
and that was translated.
It's so dense. It's really dense, but you get in about 60 pages, you get all of, almost all of Lavelle. But if you think Conrad-Martius is hard, but he is, for being good for the soul, good for the spirit. I'm edified. He's the only metaphysician I've ever read who elevated my spirits. So he's remarkable, and I just don't understand. Well, I think existentialism came in, and he just was swept away, and phenomenology caught on, and he was swept away. I don't know how to account. Jeremy, do you have any theories of how he's fallen into oblivion?
Well, there was a whole movement
That's right.
that flourished between the world wars,
That's right.
sometimes called French spiritualism, and a whole bunch of figures were associated with that,
Yeah.
including some who are still known, like Marcel or even Ricoeur.
Yeah. Marcel was
But for whatever reason, they were really, seems like philosophy in France almost consciously turned their back on them.
no.
And the thing about Lavelle is he was the professor. There's this idea of the Collège de France, and then you get that position. And was it Merleau-Ponty, the professor of the Collège de France too? But I think he came in after, but Lavelle had that position, I think after Bergson.
Yeah, but Lavelle followed Bergson. Mhm.
And so, and he's, what to say about him?
Yeah, he was.
I've actually read like 5 of the dense volumes in French over the number of years. I'm also totally into it. Although I like Rossini more now, sorry.
That's right.
But yeah, he's really interesting. And it's really kind of nuts that he's so neglected. I agree.
And a lot of popular writings. He has about 7 volumes of popular writings, which are not, they're popular in the way Fichte's writings are popular. You don't have to know the system, but you to get into them. But there'll be essays on all sorts of interesting people, poets and so forth. And but it's probably.
But I think one book that was probably the best is La Présence Totale, which aren't you working on translating on that? And that's quite short, unlike the others.
Yes.
But if there's so much in that, I keep going back to that.
Yeah.
And yeah, frankly, I studied him for like 10 years. I'm still working on it. And it wasn't until after reading 4 or 5 or 6 of his books that I finally saw, especially Deux Lettres, there are things in there that didn't come out so clearly, his whole idea of being.
No.
And then Deux Lettres, he wrote an earlier version and then a later version after he revised it, and it goes on and on.
No.
But almost none of it's been translated.
No. Well,
Has some come out in German though? Am I thinking of somebody else?
he's a couple of his books are the Total Presence is in German, and I think that's all that's in German though. Totale Gegenwart. So anyhow, everybody, good seeing you all. Have a good couple of weeks.
You too.
Thank you all so much.
God bless.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye
everybody.
bye.